Hey everybody, welcome to Board Online, Board Offline. Today we have How to Play Mage Knight Part 2. Now, I was originally planning on this being a 3-part series. Actually, I think originally a 2-part series. Then it became a 3-part. But Part 3 is going to be all about combat. I was going to put combat in this video, but this video is just going to be the player's turn with everything except for combat. Combat is definitely involved enough to where we're going to make that its own video. And then there may be a 4th video just to kind of fill in some gaps in the rules, talk about some individual scenario stuff. I don't know. We'll figure out what that 4th video will be. The 3rd one, though, will be combat. This will be a player's turn with the exception of combat. Now, before we get into the video, I do want to mention our sponsor, Board Game Co. This is a fantastic website where you can buy, sell, and trade games. They have a great selection to choose from if you're just looking to build out your collection, just trying to, fill in some gaps in your collection. Maybe you're missing that one game that'll make you have the perfect collection. Board Game Co. might be able to help you out with that. They also have a great system for buying games from you. If you're trying to get rid of 7 games, don't send them to 7 different people. Send them to Board Game Co. Makes it very easy. Ship them all to one place. Very easy to, trim down your collection a little bit. And then, of course, they have a trade system. If you have a Board Game Geek username and you have set up a trade list on Board Game Geek, you then can take your username, drop it into Board Game Co. They'll compare your trade list with their stock, build a custom trade list right there on their website. Makes it very easy to facilitate a trade. If you do check them out, click on the link in the description below so they know I sent you over there. Board Game Co. makes it easy to buy, sell, and trade your way into a better collection. Okay, let's get down to the table. Sorry for the mess here. I've realized that as I film these instructional videos, at the beginning I'm trying very hard to stay organized where all the different pieces are, and then towards the end of a video it just explodes out on the table. Anyway, we're going to get down to the table. I'm going to show you how to play Mage Knight, a player's turn. Some tactic cards, skill tokens, and the village description card offer players options that are labeled as before their turn or on another player's turn. For game purposes, both of these are the same. The player can play them while others are playing or just before their own turn. Players may even use these effects immediately prior to their own turn, even if they are the first player to play in the round. These effects usually allow the player to draw cards from the deed deck. After resolving any tactic cards at the start of their turn, the player checks to see if their deed deck is empty. If it is empty and the end of round has not yet been announced, the player may forfeit their turn and announce end of round. If they do, each other player gets to take one final turn and then the round is over. Just to reiterate, the player may only announce end of round if their deed deck is empty at the start of their turn. Also, if the player's deed deck is empty and they have no cards in their hand, then they must declare end of round. If the player has no cards in their deed deck and they have no cards in their hand and the end of round has already been called, then they simply forfeit their turn. If the player forfeits their turn ends immediately and they may not even use the benefits of the map space they currently occupy. Assuming the player does not forfeit their turn, they have 2 options. They may play a regular turn or they may rest. In both cases, the player must play or discard at least 1 card by the end of their turn. The one exception to this is if the player's hand is empty but there are still cards in their deed deck at the beginning of their turn. So first, let's discuss a regular turn. Playing a regular turn has 2 voluntary parts, movement and action. First, during a regular turn, the player may move. While moving, they may reveal new map tiles. We'll discuss movement in more detail a little later in this video. It's possible the player's movement may result in a mandatory action. If they end their movement in the same space as another player, then player versus player combat is initiated. If they entered a fortified site such as a keep, a mage tower, or a city, they must fight all garrisoned enemies. If their movement ended because they were attacked by a rampaging enemy, they must fight these enemies. We'll discuss combat in detail in the next video. If there are no mandatory actions, the player may choose to perform one and only one voluntary action. At an inhabited site, such as a mage tower, monastery, keep, village, or city, the player may interact with the locals. We'll discuss in detail how to interact with the locals shortly. At adventure sites such as ruins, dungeons, tombs, monster den, and spawning grounds, the player may decide to explore. Generally, this leads to combat. If there are rampaging enemies, marauders, or draconum, in one or more adjacent spaces, the player may decide to challenge one or more of them in combat. At a monastery, the player may decide to burn it. This will lead to combat. If none of these actions are available, or if the player does not wish to take any of these actions, then they can do nothing. But it is important to remember that whether mandatory or voluntary, the player may only take one action per turn. It's also important to remember that if the player wishes to reveal new tiles, they must do so before taking any actions. If, instead of taking a regular turn, the player rests, they may not move, initiate combat, or interact with the locals. If the player has at least one card other than a wound in their hand, they may take a standard rest. To take a standard rest, the player discards one non-wound card and any number of wound cards from their hand. It's important to recognize that this is not the same as healing, since the wound cards go into the discard pile rather than being removed from the player's deck. If the player only has wound cards in their hand, then they must take a slow recovery. To take a slow recovery, the player reveals a hand showing they have only wound cards. They then discard one wound card to their discard pile. Before or after the player rests, they may play any number of healing and special effects. Once the player has finished their turn, they announce their turn is over. The player then re-rolls any mana dice they used and places them back in the source. Once the mana dice are back in the source, the next player may begin their turn while the current player finalizes their turn. However, the next player is free to wait until the turn is finalized if they wish, but it speeds up play if they go ahead and begin their turn at this point. Now let's discuss each part of a player's turn in detail, starting with movement. A regular turn is any turn in which a player is not resting. A player may move during a regular turn, and during movement they can reveal new map tiles, as we've discussed. All movement must be completed prior to the player taking any actions. When moving, a player may play any amount of movement effects. A movement effect is marked with this symbol. Most of the time, a movement effect generates move points, as you see here. A player may play any number of movement cards from their hand and may optionally power them with mana. They can use movement skills as well. And if they have any units that provide movement, they can use that as well. Any deed card other than a wound can be played sideways as move 1. Players are also allowed to play any number of special effects and healing during movement. The player totals the move points provided by all their cards and effects. In this case, move 2, and move 2 is move 4. They may then move their figure space by space, spending move points according to the type of terrain they move into. A player may only ever move into accessible adjacent spaces. The cost of moving into a type of terrain is marked on the day-night board, as you see here. Spaces marked with an X are inaccessible. It's important to realize the cost to move into the desert and forest terrain differs according to whether it is day or night. So during the daytime, forest costs 3 and desert costs 5, and it's reversed at night. Also, it's important to realize that the cost to move into a city is always 2, regardless of day or night, and regardless of the type of terrain the city is built upon. Let's discuss some important movement limitations. Entering a space with an unoccupied fortified site, such as a keep, including a keep owned by another player, immediately ends the player's movement and is considered to be an assault on that site. The player is not allowed to enter a space occupied by a rampaging enemy. That enemy must first be defeated. If a player moves from one space adjacent to a rampaging enemy to another space adjacent to a rampaging enemy. That rampaging enemy has been provoked and they will attack. This ends movement immediately. Entering a space with an adventure site, such as a dungeon, does not necessarily end the player's movement. The player may ignore the site and treat it as an empty space, even if there are enemy tokens on it already. As previously mentioned, players can reveal new map tiles while moving. The player can only reveal new tiles if they occupy a space adjacent to a position where a new tile can be added. Tiles must be placed in positions defined by the symbols on their corners, and no tile can be added behind the coastline, so here. Keep in mind as well that this coastline stretches out infinitely in that direction and this direction, so no matter how far away you get from the starting tile, players still cannot add tiles behind the coastline. To reveal a tile, a player must spend 2 movement points. The tile then comes from the tile deck and is placed accordingly. If the player were in a position where a tile could be placed on either side of them, then they must decide prior to revealing the tile which spot it will be placed in. Tiles are always oriented in a defined direction based on the number of their tile. All numbers will be oriented the same way. Depending on the back color of the tile, either brown or green, tiles have some limitations on how they may be placed. Countryside tiles with the green back must be placed so that they will be adjacent to at least 2 other tiles, like this, or adjacent to a tile which is adjacent to 2 other tiles. Core tiles with the brown back can only be placed so that they are adjacent to 2 other tiles. If there are ever no tiles left in the tile deck when a player attempts to explore, they may use a random countryside tile that was set aside at the beginning of the game. If a player manages to go through all of the set aside countryside tiles, then they may use a non-city core tile. However, pulling random tiles from the box comes with an additional limitation. All tiles explored in this way must be placed so that they are adjacent to 3 other tiles. If there are no more tiles in the box, then no more tiles can be explored. For all sites on a newly revealed tile, the player checks the When Revealed section of the associated site description card and follows the text. So for instance, with the Mage Tower, when revealed, place a violet enemy token face down on the space. The token is revealed during the day if the player is adjacent to it. And for marauding orcs, a green token is placed face up. Players should keep in mind that when a monastery is revealed, it doesn't technically have a when revealed section, but for training, it does say when a monastery is revealed here, and that's where it reminds the player to put the top card of the advanced actions deck face up in the unit's offer. Make sure to do this every time a new monastery is revealed. If a tile with a city in its center is revealed, the player takes the corresponding city card and places it nearby. The player then consults the scenario description to see what level city it will be. Then they take the corresponding city figure and set its level by turning the dial at the bottom to the appropriate level. There will be a number of round discs inside that window. In this case, 3 purple and 1 white. And these are the enemies that players place on the city card that they will be facing to conquer the city. During movement, the player may move as many spaces and explore as many tiles as they can pay move points for. The player is allowed to alternate between moving, exploring, and then moving again. The player is also allowed to play additional effects at any time during their movement to add move points to their total. This includes after a new tile is revealed. However, it's important to keep in mind that a player, when playing a card, must decide then if they are going to power it with mana or not. If they don't when they play it, they cannot later go back to the card and power it with mana after the fact. Some effects modify the rules of movement. These apply to all movement done after the effect is played until the end of the turn. Some effects reduce the move cost of certain terrains, or in the case of pathfinding, all terrains. If a player has more than one of this type of effect, they can apply them in any order. If the move cost of a particular terrain type is reduced to 0, the player may enter spaces of this terrain without paying any move points. However, the move cost of terrain cannot be reduced below 0. Some cards allow a player to enter inaccessible terrain at a certain cost, such as the strong ability of Song of Wind. It's very important players still end their turn on a safe space, otherwise forced withdrawal rules will apply. A space is considered to be safe if it is accessible under normal circumstances, it is not an unconquered fortified site or a keep owned by an opponent, and it does not contain another hero except for sites that allow more heroes, such as Portal and Conquered Cities. We'll discuss forced withdrawal during the end of turn section of this video. Some effects directly allow players to move one or more spaces. For this, do not pay any cost other than what the effect states, and the players may also move over inaccessible spaces if the effect allows, including those occupied by rampaging enemies or fortified sites. Some of these effects require the player to end this move on a safe space. Now let's discuss how moving relates to other players in the game. A player is allowed to pass through spaces occupied by another player's figure, unless it's a keep owned by another player. It's also allowed to enter the same space as another player in order to reveal a new map tile and then continue moving. If a player enters a space as another player and they do not want to keep moving or cannot keep moving, it is considered an attack on that player. An attack on another player is considered to be the player's action for the turn. It is never allowed to perform another action on a space occupied by another player. Also, if the players were both on a space where multiple players are allowed, combat is not allowed there. If the player ever ends their turn on a portal space, they remove their figure from the board and place it in front of themselves. It will then be placed back on the portal space at the start of their next turn. If the player enters a conquered city, they place their figure off the map on the corresponding city card. They will place it back on the map when they move away from the city. There may be certain situations where player versus player combat is not allowed. If the player ends their movement on the same space as another player in these situations, they cannot do any action on their turn and forced withdrawal will be required. Again, we'll talk about forced withdrawal momentarily. The following are 4 situations in which player versus player combat are not allowed. End of round has been called, and each player has their last turn for the round. The scenario conditions were met, and each player has their last turn for the game. The players are playing a cooperative scenario, or players agreed at the beginning of the game that player versus player combat is not allowed. The players are playing a team scenario and land on their teammate's space. Players can interact with locals at several different locations on the map. Villages, mage towers conquered by that player, monasteries, keeps conquered by that player, and cities conquered by that player. Interacting is the player's action for the turn. When interacting, the player may play any amount of influence effects to generate influence points. The player may play influence cards from their hand, optionally powering them with mana. They may use influence skills, and they may activate units that have influence abilities. Just as with movement, the influence effect means players get the indicated number of influence points. Any deed card other than a wound may be played sideways for influence 1. Also, players may play any number of special and healing effects during interactions. The player totals the influence points provided by all effects and then modifies it by their reputation. So in this case, influence 2 plus, let's say, nighttime, so influence 3, that's 5, and then the player's reputation adds 1 additional influence. As you can see, the player's reputation can range from +5 influence down to -5 influence. And if the player's token has moved all the way to the X, then they cannot interact at all. If interacting in a conquered city, the player adds 1 influence to their total for each shield token they have on the city card. It is possible if the player's modifications are high enough, they may not need to spend any influence effects to interact at all. Once a player has calculated their influence, they can spend it on whatever the site offers. A player can recruit a unit from the unit offer as long as one of the unit types matches the current site. In this case, scouts actually match all the possible sites, and so they can be recruited. However, something like the Utem Swordsman could not be recruited from a village because they only have the Stronghold site on their card. The influence cost for recruiting the unit is stated in the upper left corner of the card. Also keep in mind that while a unit is immediately available for the player to use once they have purchased it, they may not use the unit's influence effect to pay its own influence cost. Healing can be purchased at the village for 3 influence points and at a monastery for 2 influence points. We'll discuss healing more a little later in the next video. A player can learn new advanced actions at a monastery for 6 influence points. An advanced action learned at a monastery must come from the unit offer and may not come from the advanced action offer. This advanced action is then placed on top of the player's deed deck as normal. Remember, advanced actions from the unit offer are not replenished until the start of the next round. A player may learn new spells from the spell offer at the mage tower that they've conquered. To gain a spell, a player must pay 7 influence points as well as 1 mana of the same color as the spell they wish to acquire. A newly gained spell is placed on top of the player's deed deck, and then the spell offer is replenished. Each city has its own interaction options depicted on the lower half of the city card as well. In the green city, the player may pay 6 influence to gain a card from the advanced action offer, or a random card from the top of the advanced action deck. The gained card is then put on top of their deed deck as normal. And remember, if the card came from the offer must be replenished. In the white city, the player can recruit units of all types. Also, the player can pay 2 influence points to add 1 elite unit card to the unit offer. In the red city, the player can buy artifacts for 12 influence points each. The artifact is drawn at the end of the turn. And finally, in the blue city, the player can buy spells the same way they can at the mage tower. Regardless of the location of the interaction, whether it's a city or one of the places we've discussed previously, a player may buy any number of things of the same or different types during that interaction, as long as they have the influence to pay for it. It's also important to remember that the reputation bonus or penalty is only applied once, regardless of how many things the player buys. When the player finalizes their turn, the first thing they should do is re-roll any used mana dice and return them to the source. Once this is done, as we've previously mentioned, the next player may begin their turn if they wish, while the current player finishes finalizing theirs. If the player did not end their turn on a safe space, then they must complete a forced withdrawal. First, the player backtracks their move until they arrive at a safe space. Then, for each space the player backtracked, they add 1 wound to their hand. After adding that wound, the forced withdrawal is complete. After resolving the forced withdrawal, if any, next the player cleans up their play area. First, they return all mana tokens used or unused from their play area to the bank. Then they put any cards played this turn into their discard pile. Keep in mind, if a card was thrown away, it is removed from the game, unless it's a wound, in which case it goes back to the wound pile. Next, the player may use the benefits of their current space if applicable. If they ended their turn on a magical glade, as you see here, they may throw away 1 wound card from their hand or discard pile. Keep in mind, though, that units may not be healed this way. If the player ended their turn on a crystal mine, they gain the crystal of the mine's color to their inventory. Keep in mind that a player may have no more than 3 crystals of the same color in their inventory. Next, the player collects any rewards from combat. The player may pick their rewards in whatever order they choose if they have multiple rewards coming to them. If the player won random crystals, they roll the die for each reward to determine what color they receive. When rolling for random crystals, if they roll black, the player gains 1 fame instead. And if they roll gold, they choose the color they want. If the player won any artifacts, the player draws that many artifacts plus 1 from the deck. The player then places 1 of them on the bottom of the artifacts deck and all remaining artifacts on top of their deed deck. If the player won spells or advanced actions, they choose them from the corresponding offer and put them on top of their deed deck. The player then replenishes the offer, as we've discussed before, by moving the remaining cards down and adding new cards to the topmost position. When gaining advanced actions in this way, they may not come from the unit offer. If the player won units, they take the unit from the unit offer regardless of its type or cost. If they do not have an open command token for the unit to occupy, they must disband one of their units or forfeit the reward. However, if the player has no open command tokens, but they did level up this turn, which would gain them a new command token, they may postpone taking the new unit until they process their level up. Speaking of which, next is the level up process. If the player crossed one or more lines on the game track this turn, each line crossed allows the player to gain a level. When advancing to a level marked with this icon, the player removes the top level token, revealing their new armor value and hand limit, and the level token is flipped over, so it is shield side up, and then this is placed in the unit area to become a new command token for the player. When advancing to a level marked with these icons, the player flips the top 2 skill tokens from their skill deck, and they now have 2 options. The player may take one of the 2 skill tokens and put the other in the common skill area, so they may choose to take this one and then place this one in the common skill area. The player then also takes one advanced action card from the advanced action offer. Alternatively, the player may take a token of another player from the common skills area and use that as their own now, in which case both of their received skills would go into the common skills area. And the player then takes the advanced action from the lowest position on the advanced action offer. So there you go, that's part 2 of our Mage Knight tutorial. Be sure to come back for part 3. Really, after part 3, you really should have everything you need to know to play the game, but part 4 will be coming along as well shortly after that, most likely. Thanks again for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. And until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.